Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. My name is Jas Borthhuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and we are full house today. We've got Mark DeSantis, Murray Dahm, Mark McCaffrey, and Lindsay Powell here with you to discuss something in between, because we don't have an issue to discuss. That was last time. And during our pre-podcast meeting, Murray suggested we discuss the Marian reforms, because that's one of those big topics that is bandied about a lot. And it's an interesting one that is perhaps a bit more debatable than might seem at first blush. So, Murray, why don't you tell us what people usually consider to be the Marian reform?
Lovely. So, yes, indeed, the Marian reforms are this set of reforms to the Roman late Republican army that are given responsibility to Caius Marius, the Novus Homo consul of 107, 105 to 100 BC, so consul 6 times. And we get various ancient sources that give him credit for these reforms. And so the first of them is in 107 BC, so during his first consulship. We're told by Sallust that he enrolls soldiers not according to the classes in the manner of our forefathers, but allowing anyone to volunteer, for the most part, the proletariat. So that is that he ignores the Servian wealth classes that have been in place since the 6th century BC, and therefore anyone can be a Roman legionary who's a citizen. The most fascinating thing about that, of course, is that it eliminates the hastati, principes, velites, and triarii. And from there on, you get a similar Roman legionary to everyone else. So every Roman legionary looks like every other Roman legionary. I think there are 6 in total. So that's the first one, is to ignore the wealth categories. The second one is the elimination of the maniple as the fighting unit, and to move to the cohort as the fighting unit. He puts a wooden peg into the pilum, and therefore Plutarch describes how it's going to bend, and it's this amazing reform to it's very hard to say these without talking about why they're wrong. That he reforms the Roman pilum. The next one is, the best evidence for it is actually Pliny's Natural History. He tells us that Marius reforms the standards of the Roman legions and modifies them from what were 5: the eagle, the minotaur, the boar, the horse, and
wolf.
The wolf, yes, the lupus. So those 5, and then they now will only use the eagle. And they're all given responsibility to him, generally between 107 and 104 BC, whilst he's either defeating Jugurtha in Numidia, or he is not before he defeats the Cimbri and the Teutones, but in the build-up to him defeating the Cimbri and the Teutones.
The other one will surely be the Marius's mule carrying the on the forca, right?
So the idea of the self-sufficient legionary who looks like every other legionary is, of course, the Marian mule. That's, and again, Plutarch
getting rid of the train as well.
Yes, Plutarch gives us 2 etymologies of where the Marian mule comes from. One, that this reform means that they become Marian mules. The other is that they're called Marian mules because of something he did under Scipio Aemilianus in Numantia in 133 BC, that he brought out mules, and so therefore they're called Marian mules, is like a funny saying.
Let's open up the shooting gallery. Who wants to take a stab at which one is the easiest, perhaps, to disprove, or should be immediately disproven?
Probably the pilum is the easiest one to disprove.
I would go for the pilum. The pilum, of course, you've got this, we're told traditionally that legionaries, well, going back to the manipular army, that you've got the first 2 orders are carrying pila, 2 each, for each soldier, I should say. And for each legionary carrying the pillar, they've got a light and a heavy. And I think it's more specifically the heavy pilum that has got, whereas the light pilum is actually socketed in terms of, I should explain, a pilum is, of course, a 2-piece throwing spear, which has got the metal head and the wooden shaft. And, of course, in terms of the light pilum, the head, which is elongated, is socketed onto the shaft, whereas the heavy pilum is actually affixed in terms of a tang fitting in. Now, there's two different varieties of that. You get a square or rhombus shaped tang going into a square head of the shaft. There is an alternative round version, but in either case they are fixed with or riveted to each other with a couple of pegs. And there's this explanation that Marian reforms bring in an idea that you don't want the pilum being thrown back at you once it is thrown, because of course the Roman soldiers, apparently, when they march into the advance, they throw the light pilum, which has something like a distance of maybe 30 meters, and then a couple of steps later throw your heavy pilum, and once they're discharged, then engage. Now, you don't want those being thrown back at you, so the idea with the Marian reform is apparently that they're inserting a wooden peg, which is going to somehow break when it actually impacts. How this actually happens, that's the big problem. The actual shaft would probably bend on impact if it was hitting something heavy enough in any case. But why one wooden peg along with two metal pegs is going to make a difference is a bit of a
or replacing one metal peg with a wooden peg, but in which case I guess the idea is you get a hinging pilum.
Well, I mean, the idea is if it's got that elongated head to it, that it's got a nice little triangular pyramidal head to it, which is going to penetrate a shield or any protection, ideally. And if it doesn't hit the incumbent behind that shield, then at least it's going to stick in the shield. And actually, probably the weight of the pilum, if you've held one of these, there's enough weight on it that if it's sticking out of a shield, it's going to probably bend, and there's going to be a bugger to actually get out of the shield anyway. Because
the shank, which is what you're talking about, the long metal part, is not a hardened piece of metal, while the actual point is. So therefore, the point will go through, and then the idea is that the softer metal of the shank will bend. And as you said, it
doesn't make much sense in terms of the metal peg as such, if that really useless. Did much difference. And I mean, at the same time, if we get to the pilum as a whole, the whole idea of I think there's only one source that actually says, gives us evidence to say that legionaries did carry two into battle with them, and in some battles they're not mentioned at all. So actually the gist of this being a crucial change to the Roman legionary setup, there's a lot of, how can I say, a common legend about it rather than actual firm evidence to actually back up.
My guess is that it's tied about a couple of things. One is that the idea that the pilum has to bend, right? That may be a misunderstanding by presumably going to be Polybius and Plutarch, whoever the sources are for that.
Plutarch and Sallust mostly, I think. Yeah.
Okay. If you have a wooden peg and it actually causes the metal haft and the wood to break off, it still renders the missile immobile from the point of view you can't throw it back. You're left with a stick, basically, which isn't terribly useful. So I think that can be argued as being a positive. Was Marius the inventor of that? Who knows?
Well, the problem archaeologically, of course, is there are three types of pilum: spike-tanged, broad-tanged, and socketed. And we've got surviving examples with both rivets in metal. We've got other designs whereby one of the metal pegs wouldn't work because it doesn't do what Plutarch describes it doing. And the idea of the shaft bending isn't what Plutarch says. He says that the wooden peg will break and then it will essentially create a pivot. So therefore it's going to be angled by the breaking of the wooden peg, not bending. So the bending is what we think, because of the soft iron that it's going to bend when it hits and therefore be immobile. That's not what Plutarch describes. For those of you reading along at home, it's Plutarch's Life of Marius, chapter 25.
But we also know, having been a reenactor, that you can actually bend the metal piece. And in fact, we do have bent ones which we've recovered from archaeological sites. So that is a sort of phenomenon that does happen just through use. And again, it depends on how you throw these things. If you throw them like a modern Olympic javelin thrower, which means you sort of throw them and you have a high sort of arc, I'm not quite sure what that trajectory is called, as opposed to sort of throwing them presumably at a flatter surface, which What you're trying to do is get behind the person carrying the shield. The target is not the shield. It's the holder of the shield is what you're trying to kill or injure.
But presumably that's why generally there's samples of all kinds of lengths. The shank is quite long. If it's a 2-foot shank, even if you go through the shield itself, the idea is that the point will still get the person behind. Actually, we ran an article on this particular, I looked it up, on this particular myth in Ancient Warfare 5.1, the peg that would break, in which it says that Peter Connolly did extensive experiments with this thing. It just doesn't work. If it's properly socketed, the forces on on a wooden peg aren't such that it will break. It'd have to be loose already, so that the impact can cause the metal shank to move against the peg, which might break it if it's thin and fragile. But if it's properly socketed, it's not going to move anyway. So it's kind of it seems that Plutarch misunderstood something there, or it was an experiment that got transmitted to him somehow. Maybe it was the telephone game, and he got it didn't get to him in any usable shape, and he was probably not interested in doing the experiment himself.
As a second century AD, second sophistic author, yes, probably. Interesting, and just passed it on.
Dear slaves, could you create some of these pila for me? I have some idea.
All right, what's next on the chopping block? What about the wealth qualifications?
Well, the wealth qualifications have been changing for a while, though, hadn't they? I mean, there'd been movement going back to the Punic Wars in terms of, yes, there'd been always qualifications that a soldier, a legionary, apparently had to meet, but what those qualifications were, and I think when it gets to Marius, it's more the fact that he's going to what they refer to as the Capitacense, which is basically when they do the census, all those citizens who are just too poor to actually be bothered to be qualified as anything in terms of wealth, who are the lowest of the low. But in terms of before the Marian reforms, you're sort of talking about, I think it was 11,000 that
it's
they sort of got down to, but it's like that's about a third
4,000
of what
even.
Is it?
Comes down a lot more in the second century.
But yeah, again, it's something that's been moving goalposts for a long time.
But the problem with this one is, of course, is that a whole theory pivots on this one claim that this is the point where, instead of the militia of Roman citizen soldiers who do their duty to the state to serve a maximum of 16 years up to 20 years in emergencies in the Roman army via the delectus, has become too onerous. And Marius makes this change, and then suddenly you get a lot of soldiers, the majority of the soldiers in armies consist of the urban poor, who have no vested interest in the state, and are only this is a theory. The only interest that they have is in making money, and they consider their general to be the source of their future income, and therefore they're loyal to him and not the state. And this is the root cause of the generalissimos who cause all the civil wars in the 1st century BC, which end in the empire.
Well, it's opening a whole can of worms there, and because you're again going back to saying, well, actually, before that, it's also the social conditions that the armies created.
That's the theory of why Marius's reforms lead to Caesar, is that because of what he does, that leads on. And so the issue is that you can unpack that and say, well, that's not what caused it, but it's still commonly stated as the cause for Sulla and Pompey and Crassus. Yeah.
I mean, if you're going back in terms of the long-term effects of the legions having to be away from home, going to the Punic War era, and after that you've got longer campaigns, you've got more soldiers that are having a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to actually being away for that long, because for a lot of them it's an agrarian society. They are trying to sustain farming activities, which just don't work if you're starting to be away for all the year or even more. And of course that means that the low how can I say, the low-income farming communities are starting to go out of business and having to sell out to, of course, the generals who are actually the aristocrats who are making money out of the warfare. And so you've got a larger group of poor then migrating to the cities, etc. And if you go along those lines, then that's why, of course, you've got the changes in terms of the property qualifications, etc.
The interesting thing that's always overlooked is that, so Marius is, according to Sallust, puts this reform in 107 to recruit his own army for Numidia. Not so it's an emergency. He's the novice homo. No one believes he can do the job, so he has to basically enroll an army that no one else is going to give him. And they've got other armies. There's two off, fighting the Cimbri and the Teutones in Gaul. So it's kind of I need troops. But then when he's elected for his second consulship in absentia in 105, he's asked, do you want to keep the army that you just won victory with in Numidia, or would you like Rutilius Rufus's army? And so Rutilius Rufus is poor old Rutilius Rufus. He's the one who outlaws any under 25-year-old leaving Italy, including his own sons, and institutes that the Roman legions, for the first time ever, will be trained by gladiator trainers. So they're learning individual dueling. And when Marius is given the option of, do you want your own army that you've just won victory with, or would you like Rutilius Rufus's army? He says, I'll take Rutilius Rufus's army. So this whole relaxing of the property qualification doesn't necessarily lead to an army that's any better. And Rutilius Rufus goes, well, I've made a better army. And Marius goes, yes, you have. I'll use that one. So that kind of blanket, well, this is the moment where everything changes. That's not true, as it is with virtually every other Marian reform. They're virtually all processes, or they didn't happen at all, like the people.
And have you said that the only genuine reform, it's an ad, would be the Aquila, the eagle, to the five others?
No, because when you read Pliny says the eagle has always been the first, but in the past there were four others. But they'd been left behind in camp for many years. And you're like, well, how far back does that take us? He now says there will only be the Aquila. He's not introducing the eagle. He's just saying we'll get rid of the other four. So it's a
standardization, really.
And the other thing is, if he's eliminated the velites, hastati, principes, they wouldn't have standards anyway. Well, the problem is, of course, the standards according to Pliny are carried by each ordo, and now there will only be one. And the whole idea of antipolani, which is originally the hastati, we still get the phrase antipolani, but there's no hastati anymore. Right into the empire, you start to get antipolani soldiers. They're fighting in front of the standard, but
Signani, you mean?
I think they're still called. I'm not sure.
The anti-Signani?
No, it might be anti-Signani. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Antipolani would be in front of the spear. That's a bit strange, mate.
That's the enemy.
Very strange.
Hopefully.
Or civil wars, who knows? Anyway.
How do you see all of these changes working into the advent of a standardized legionary and then being grouped into larger cohorts as opposed to the smaller maniples? Was the larger cohort just something that was more useful, more effective on the battlefield? There was a larger unit that could take on more tasks? Because that seems to me to be a good explanation for it.
Well, it was also not a new thing.
Yeah, you get cohorts as early as the mid 5th century, which is problematic because, most of our historians...
The sources aren't. Yeah.
May be anachronistic. They may be using the term cohort in their understanding of cohort. I think Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Livy use cohort anachronistically. We think anachronistically, but I think, for instance, Sycius uses a cohort of 800 men, I think, in the mid 5th century BC, which is like, wait, what? So, yes, and you still get the mention of maniple. There are some coins of 42 BC, I think it is, that have the Aquila, but next to them they have two vexilla, one of which has a P on it and one of which has an H on it. And you're like, what does that stand for, if not principes and hastati?
But again, cohort doesn't have to necessarily mean what it means later on, because in terms of linguistically, it could have actually been simply a phrase for a A rough body of men as such. It doesn't have to be the exact numbers that you come up. Well, I say exact numbers. The numbers do change over the years, but it could be just a phrase, just like in terms of later on, the word legion itself actually changes.
The standard caveat we need to put everywhere is like they use these terms, they may not mean what we think they mean.
Well, yeah, Homer uses phalanx. You're like, wait, what? As a body of men, and in Greek history, lokos means different things in different cities, but the historians just bandy the word lokos around.
And of course, maniple just means a handful, basically. So,
and is also a term that co-manipulares, for instance, as comrade, the terms stick around for much longer than we think that the units or the organization does.
Then if we're not going to attribute these reforms to Marius, why were they attributed to Marius so strongly, either at roughly the time in the ancient world, or maybe is it a historiographical problem that dates to the 19th century? Was Marius simply the great general of the very late second century BC who used such legions when these reforms seem to have gelled and won victories, because it all focuses on him, right? And
all of the above, I think.
If you give him credit, he's one of the great military reformers of all time for all of these things, but it looks like you can't give him credit for all of these things.
I think it's not a 19th century thing, it's an ancient, Sallust credits him, Plutarch credits him, it's an ancient, is it Granius Licinius credits him too. So it's an ancient credit that he gets, and I think it is because of what he achieves. It is the successive consulships. It's the fact that he defeats Jugurtha and then makes the boastful claim that he will defeat the Cimbri and the Teutones, and does by 101 BC. So that accomplishment means he's the figure that you can pin all of this on, even though we can now see processes of these things beginning before him and lasting well beyond him. It's bizarre that some of these reforms are only coming into place permanently under Julius Caesar, because you would think in the ancient world, surely they're going to credit Julius Caesar with those reforms. And they don't.
But actually, if you think about Sallust writing, Sallust is writing during Caesar's time, when Caesar is, of course, using the propaganda of saying, I am, walking in the footsteps of my uncle by marriage, Marius, of course. So actually, for Caesar, it pays to sort of give great credit to Marius. And if anybody wants to go to town on writing about that, go ahead, Sallust.
Well, he was called the third founder of Rome for a reason, wasn't he? Except that it turns out it couldn't have been, because Camillus was already after Marius.
Yeah, the interesting thing, I think, in that sense, is that why that persists.
In part because the sources are crap. I mean, there's the second century sources, there's a gap between, the Numantian campaign, and then there's a lot of, not very much, certainly not about the army. Then you get Marius, and then we have another gap in which is the social war, which brings about extremely important changes in the Roman army. Namely, suddenly Rome doesn't get whole legions more or less for free from the Italian allies anymore. Suddenly, all those Italian allies are part of the manpower resource for Rome itself, but Rome also has to pay for them. And they're all suddenly also citizens who are not liable for the tax that pays for the army. So the whole financial calculus changes enormously within 15 years of 20 years of the Marian reforms. But the source is not great. And then they only sort of come back in the years afterwards. So that makes it extremely attractive to just go, oh, look, there's this one shining beacon of Sallust going, this is where it all began. Bing!
By the second century, there's not that revisionism going, no, it wasn't him. So it doesn't seem like there's a historiographical tradition of going, no, it wasn't Marius. There's only a historical tradition of it was Marius. So, when we've got these second century sources, they reinforce the view that it's Marius.
But the second century sources are still elites who are not very interested in who is the poor soldier.
Historical truth. No, true.
I was going to say, in terms of going back to why Marius, it does coincide with certainly some changes definitely happening in terms of the Roman army, in terms of we've got the disappearance around about this time of the cavalry, in terms of any Roman or Italian cavalry disappearing from Roman armies from this point on, and by the time of Caesar, definitely there are no Roman cavalry around. You've also got the velites, and there's lots of argument as to, did they actually exist, and if so, were they a regular feature, and in what capacity? But as of going down past the Civil War, Social War, I should say, there is not really any mention of them anymore either. So something is happening definitely in terms of revolution within the army.
But the cavalry comes largely from the Soci, and they're all becoming legionaries now. So now 3/4 of the cavalry is gone. So you have to find them elsewhere. And we see suddenly more and more in the civil wars, we get lots and lots of mentions of cavalry, Spanish, Greek, Celt, later Germanic auxiliary troops doing all kinds of stuff, including cavalry. And in fact, using in the first century BC, they're raising legions from probably non-citizen units.
It's also interesting that, when you look at the life of Marius, Plutarch tells us that he uses both Sulla and Catullus as his sources, who both wrote biographies. Presumably, both Sulla and Catullus took credit for defeating the Vercelli and the victory at Vercelli and the victory against Jugurtha in their own sources, saying I was the one who did it, it wasn't Marius at all. And you can see traces of that in Plutarch's life. And yet at the same time, they aren't going, I was the one who reformed the army, it was me, it wasn't this guy Marius who we don't like. So there's a really interesting, he gets credit for some things that you can clearly see in the tradition that those sources that Plutarch's using are removing credit to Marius for his victories, but not for these reforms.
Is that almost because he is a nervous homo, though? Because, easy to label him for it.
Yeah, but also that those reforms lead to trouble, so don't take credit for those. Not me. It was him. He caused all the bad stuff. So, you can see that almost as a.
But to your point, though, I think there is a case that we have the written sources that we have, and then there's the archaeology, and trying to reconcile some of those things doesn't always come off well.
No, absolutely. And we all know that where's the visual and the archaeological evidence of the Roman legionary at this period? You're like, well, there's the altar of Domitius Ahenobarbus.
And then it's a 60-year wait for a couple of reliefs from the mid-1st century BC. Yeah.
So, if there were more sculptural, archaeological remains of it would be like, wow, this would have all been debunked earlier, presumably, because I'm assuming that they would show us things that shouldn't exist persisting longer. Those coins where you've got a very obvious P and H. You're like, well, those just are they anomalous? Are they odd? Are they like the Corinthian helmet and Greek sculpture? Is it just a hark back to a heroic era? It's just one of those things that we just can't pin down because there's not enough evidence to hinge it all on.
But to Mark DeSantis's point, I think it points to there's a dogged, entrenched view amongst certain historians, and of course, in reading those creates a whole genre of readers who think that there are these very clear categories, these very clear cutoff points driven by particular individuals, whereas the truth we don't know, like you just said, Murray, and it's very much more fuzzy. And the likelihood some of these reforms come from people that we will never know the names of. The praefectus fabrum, assuming that this is some office that exists, who's having to equip soldiers a certain way pretty quick in the case of the Cambric Teutonic War. Because you've got to create legions from pretty much scratch. And where does that equipment come from? Well, workshops.
But a good point, Lindsay, that you bring up there, sort of maybe it's more of a segue, but it is also it's a time of crisis, so which makes it even more problematic because what Salas says, is that a reform, or is that shit? We have a crisis going on. We need to do something now, and it's a one-off. For the listeners who read French. There's a French book by François Cadieux, L'Armée Imaginaire, the Imaginary Army, that argues that the sources for the Roman soldier in the first century BC being far poorer than his predecessors are, well, pretty much non-existent, and that the composition of the army doesn't change very much, and in part that is because the elites who describe them don't really make a difference between the soldiers, those lower down the totem pole that can, in theory, afford to be a soldier, and those who can't. They're just,
you're poorer than I am. I don't care about you. Yeah, exactly right.
We may have a case with this whole thing of somebody in the 19th century, because this definitely goes back to the 19th century at least. This whole extensive theory coming up with it, and then it becomes this fundamental theory for what happens in the first century. And if you go and mess with that theory and pull it down from under everything else, then a whole lot of historiography in the first century BC falls apart. So everybody just goes, this is how it happened. This is just, yep, that's always, we've known this for a long time. This is how it happens.
I think that's like we were talking about what Lindsay brought up off camera, that, when you've got Theodore Mommsen saying this is what happened, and you've got these, absolutely pillar of modern ancient history making these arguments, it's very hard to go and say, I think he was wrong, because very often all someone needs to say to debunk your theory about, hey, let's look at this and let's relook at the sources, they don't say what we've been told they say. Their argument against you is, well, Mommsen thinks so, and you're cut down simply because someone reiterates what a 19th century historian says, or an early 20th century historian. And the other thing is, of course, that not only will you be undermining in the entire first century BC historiography, you're essentially undermining the entirety of modern ancient history from that point onwards, who've just accepted that theory as that's truth. So when you say, actually, when we relook at it, none of this is right, every single Roman history book is out of date, which some people are unwilling to, embrace.
Some publishers might be rubbing their hands. Not me, but
have we covered them all? Wealth classes, Marian mules. I think Marian mules is probably, Marian mules is a phrase, and that probably is also part of the let's create a Marius with it. That if you're talking about Marian mules, well, it must be Marius, and therefore it sort of perpetuates that idea. Even if it comes from Numantia, that's the sort of the idea. And
I mean, it might fit with the idea that Roman soldiers serve longer and longer continuously and march longer and longer distances, which, if you want to be effective, if you want to be able to, march through Italy at the speed that Caesar does, you can't have a long, heavy train. So, but might again be a development over time, for which we kind of only know the end point, which is Augustus.
Yeah, but if you look at this being the end point, actually, what we're calling Marian reforms, and actually say, going back, and you're talking about Numantia, but then going back to everything that happens after the Punic Wars, and in terms of Greece and in terms of Asia, and you've got huge numbers of men who are serving in way beyond the 16 years minimum at the start of that century. By the end of that century, if we start looking at the demographics and say, actually, maybe we can believe that when the Gracchi get up there and say we've got a crisis of manpower and we haven't got enough, maybe that was the opportunity that somebody, not necessarily Marius, but probably before Numantia, has actually taken and said, actually, you know what, we've been playing with a couple of these things over these, our campaigns of the early 2nd century. Now would be the great time to implement them, get rid of the triarii, change their, standardize the armor sort of across the legion, bring in these, say we've been going back and forth between maniples and cohorts. Let's go cohorts more seriously. it might have been an opportunity. And as you rightly say, who knows, actually, pulled that trigger and said, let's go with it, or let's, let me lead the way and show you how. And Marius just ends up being the one who comes in at the end of that process and gets the credit because he's actually got the finished product.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Arausio, according to the sources, there's 120,000 men get killed at Arausio. So there's no one left. So it's like, let's rebuild from scratch. Let's make a new one.
Yeah, I was going to talk about institutional memory, but I guess that institution was gone there.
Yeah. Yes. Caipio. We do have a couple of questions, which we may have already answered. So I put them in the chat. So Stephen says, from the standpoint of a regular soldier, would there have been any actual reforms that would have been immediately obvious as big changes? If no, is there any level in the hierarchy where the changes would have been quick enough to really be noticed as a large-scale shift?
Well, presumably there is a moment in time when it says, we're not doing the Triarii Stadia, not doing that anymore, we're doing this version. That's a moment in time, presumably. Now, does it happen universally? I have no idea. Does it happen, let's say, for example, does Marius say, in needs of expediting this?
But it isn't interesting. I've been reading the Life in the Roman Army, which one of the arguments is that
but
the
to your
Roman
point,
army
though,
is built in
I
a
think
way that
there is a case though that
if
we
you
have the
start
written
on your
sources that we have, and then there's the
seasonal
archaeology, and
service
trying to
or your
reconcile some of
one-year
those things
service,
doesn't always come up
wherever
well.
you go, whichever army you're into, the setup of each camp is the same. So as soon as you know where you've been assigned to, you know you need to go for, third maniple, principes, blah, blah, blah. And we could argue that perhaps some of these changes were introduced in one army on campaign. But how's that spread? Does that then stop, or does a senior officer or a senior centurion in another army go, hey, this actually worked better, let's do it this way? There is, as far as we know, no tradition of, the paper. There's certainly a paper mill in the Imperial Roman army, but not the kind of manuals with, okay, this is how we set up our legion. Pick up manual 5F, 133.7. Aha, this is the current version of the manual, and somebody's written it. That's still one of the most, speaking of institutional memory, that must be done in that way, just because there are people who know how things are done, and they tell everybody else how things are done, and they just keep doing it, and over time that introduces gradual
But couldn't you get the
changes.
influence of one individual come through at this point? Because you sort of got to change in terms of the aristocrats that I mentioned the cavalry before, and you would have had the idea coming through the Republic of 10 years minimum service for those, coming from aristocratic backgrounds who want to pursue, political careers, etc. But actually at this time, there seems to be a change with the disappearance of the cavalry, which they probably normally serve in. And there seems to be a cut down in terms of the number of years of service, which is deemed necessary if you are coming from that sort of background. You get more, people like the Pompeys and the Ciceros and the Caesars seem to actually tag along as adjutants to certain commanders and be there present in their concilium, learning from the poster boys of the time in terms of the great generals, and they are expounding their personal theories to them. So in that sense, could there be a break from what you're talking about in terms of the cultural memory being perpetuated through the army to actually now individuals stepping forward and saying that this is how I think it should be done?
Could be, but then that still presupposes at some point that those younger soldiers, younger officers command their own armies and then introduce those changes there. And that's how things spread. Doesn't it?
Well, I'm sort of thinking in terms of if somebody comes through with a revolutionary idea, there's more scope for a revolutionary idea actually taking hold when you start getting these young bloods being introduced to the concilium rather than just being part of the main body of
And
the
they
army.
write to their uncle who happens to be in command of another army elsewhere and say, "This is a really wonderful idea. You should try it." Yeah, I mean,
So we're talking about a society for whom innovation is fundamentally a problem. They don't like new ideas.
If you suddenly have success in a cohort of 480 men, as opposed to not having met success in a maniple of 120 men, or a century of 60 as opposed to a century of 80, those would be obvious. I think in terms of Stephen's question, you would immediately notice, oh, I'm in a century that's larger than it was under my dad's time or my grandfather's time. I'm in a tactical unit which is a bigger group of men than it used to be. I haven't heard tales of being in a cohort in that technical sense of what we understand the cohort to become. And so that idea, there probably would be some, but I think that the day-to-day life of a legionary wouldn't alter that much. You might get frowned at or eye-rolled if you turn up in your granddad's pectorale and everyone else is wearing chainmail. You're like, are we going to wear that? Oh, they're going to go, that's so 150 BC. So I think there's, but again, armor's armor. It's still going to work to a certain extent. It's not going to be as standardized as we would like to see it. But
well, your pectoral is going to work less well on the sides than the chainmail.
So yes and no, Stephen. There you go. Ralph asks the question: how do you retrain a pre-Marian reform army into a uniformly equipped cohort-based army, trained from scratch? Question.
Well, that supposes that the army was actually, it went from one form of the Legion to the Marian Reformed Legion very quickly, whereas I think that we would agree that these reforms took place over time. So I would say that how do you retrain them? You're probably introducing these alterations relatively slowly. So retraining them from scratch isn't necessary. However, I would say this: many people entering legions, since they're being enrolled on an ongoing basis, would probably have been including new soldiers who would have had to have simply been trained, not retrained, but trained, which to my mind means trained from scratch. So they're all undergoing some sort of combat training in the so-called new style of the what we'll just call the Marian type legion, for want of a better term. So that's what I would say, that that is, for example, in World War II, there had to be retraining in how to fight. Armored divisions had to retrain how to fight when various techniques and tactics were found to be outmoded during the early years of World War II. I don't know if that's necessarily what we're looking at here at the end of the second century BC.
But what's interesting, though, is what Murray said about Rutilius Rufus, which I must confess I'd not heard before, and I find very interesting. The idea that there's somebody who says gladiators are very good fighters. Let's learn from them. So presumably when you then said that Marius was actually himself impressed by that, so part of the training is now going to be gladiator school type training. Stab a post.
That idea of a clean break, again, Arausio is 120,000 lost. According to Plutarch, I think there's 10 survivors, or is it Orosius, 7th century? I mean, very tricky. 10 survivors, including Sertorius. Sertorius is a quaestor, so he survives, and he swims the River Rhone to survive it, which is interesting. And if you've only got 10 survivors out of that, 2 consular armies, and the Kimbi and the Teutones have already defeated 3 earlier consular armies, there is no one left. You are, in fact, training from scratch. There's 10 guys who have any, institutional memory of what came before. So with that Marius Rutilius Rufus kind of combination, you're like, well, yes, we are bringing in a whole bunch of new people who we haven't used before. We are training them in a new way, because what we were training them in and how we were organizing them clearly didn't work because they got munched. So in a way, the Arausio, the aftermath of Arausio in a, late 105, 104 BC is the perfect opportunity to bring in not a universal change, but the new generation of soldiers who will go forward from that point are going to be trained in this new way. And that over a relatively short period of time will then filter to the rest of Rome's armies. And again, Marius is the consul for those years leading up to 100 BC. So in a way, Marius having success with those armies, and then wherever he goes, going, well, this is the army you're going to have now, kind of makes sense, which kind of brings it full circle back to Marius.
But it could just be it's a crisis situation, and Marius is the only general who manages to win, so he gets all the credit.
Yep.
Maybe he had survivor's guilt. On that bombshell, thank you very much, and see you next time.